In the heart of London, where the 18th century was drawing its final, smoky breaths, the rain fell with a soft, persistent rhythm. It was a sound that seemed to wash the city clean, hushing the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones and the distant cries of vendors, leaving behind a glistening, melancholic quiet. The fog, that famous London shroud, would soon drift in from the Thames, blurring the sharp edges of the world, turning gas lamps into hazy, golden orbs and muffling the city in a soft, gray blanket. It was on nights like these, when the present world seemed to fade away, that the past felt closest, its ghosts free to wander the narrow lanes and whisper through the keyholes of old houses. And in one such house, on Norfolk Street, a young man named William Henry Ireland felt the pull of the past more keenly than anyone. He was not yet 20, a slight figure with eyes that seemed to hold a permanent state of dreaming, of looking at something just beyond the veil of the visible world. His world was his father's study, a room that smelled perpetually of aging paper, leather bindings, and the faint, sweet scent of decaying wood. It was a sanctuary, a cave of wonders piled high with books, manuscripts, engravings, and curiosities of every kind. His father, Samuel Ireland, was a man consumed by history, an engraver and an avid collector, a true antiquarian whose heart beat in time with centuries long gone. And the name that echoed most profoundly in this hallowed space, the name that was both a prayer and an obsession, was Shakespeare. To Samuel Ireland, William Shakespeare was not merely a playwright. He was a deity, the crowning glory of English genius. He possessed a first folio, a treasure he would handle with the reverence a priest affords a holy relic. He would speak of the bard in hushed, awe-filled tones, lamenting the cruel passage of time that had swept away so much of the great man's personal life, leaving behind only the plays and a handful of dry, legal documents. "Imagine William," he would say, his eyes distant as he stared into the flickering heart of the fireplace. "To hold in your hand a letter written by him, to see the very ink that flowed from his quill, to touch the paper that he touched. What a treasure that would be! A connection, a true connection to the soul of the man." William Henry listened to these refrains day after day, year after year. He saw the adoration in his father's eyes, and he saw, with a quiet, persistent ache, that those same eyes rarely looked upon him with anything more than mild, detached disappointment. William was not a scholar. He was not clever in the way his father admired. He was a dreamer, a romantic, lost in the Gothic novels of the day, his mind a tapestry of moonlit castles, ancient curses, and tragic heroes. His father saw this as frivolity, a lack of seriousness. And so, a deep and unspoken yearning took root in William's heart, a desperate, all-consuming need to earn his father's approval, to finally see that look of profound, soul-stirring admiration directed at him. The seed of the great deception was planted, as so many things are, on a journey. Father and son traveled to Stratford-upon-Avon, the hallowed birthplace of the bard. They walked the same streets, breathed the same midland air. But Samuel's pilgrimage was one of frustration. He found the town disappointingly bare of true relics. There was the house, yes, and the tomb in the church, but where were the manuscripts? The letters? The personal effects? He griped to the custodians. He sighed to his son, his disappointment a palpable cloud that dampened the entire trip. It was on their return journey, rattling along in the carriage as the green English countryside slipped by, that a thought, quiet and insidious as a rising mist, began to form in William's mind. If the world had no more Shakespearean relics to offer, what if one could be found? The thought was not yet a plan, merely a daydream, a fanciful what if. But it warmed him against the chill of his father's disappointment. He imagined presenting his father with a small, forgotten document. He pictured the shock, the disbelief, and then the dawning, radiant joy. The image was so powerful, so intoxicating, that it began to feel less like a fantasy and more like a destiny. Back in London, the dream began to take on a tangible form. William worked as an apprentice in a conveyancer's office, a place of dusty deeds and legal documents stretching back through the decades. It was a dry, monotonous world, But it was here that he learned the feel of old parchment, the look of faded ink, the spidery scrawl of Elizabethan script. He began to pay attention. He would spend his lunch hours not in the tavern, but in the back rooms of bookbinders and stationery shops, his fingers tracing the blank endpapers of 16th-century books, his mind quietly calculating. He learned that the parchment from the bindings of old books was perfect. It was authentically aged, brittle and yellowed by the centuries. He began to acquire small scraps, paying a few pennies here and there, hiding them away like a magpie's treasure. The next ingredient was the ink. This required more invention. He couldn't simply use the common ink of his day. It had to look faded, ancient. He experimented in the quiet of his small bedroom, late at night when the rest of the house was asleep and the only sound was the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He would set a small pot over a candle flame, a little alchemist of deception. He read old recipes. He took marble-like tannic galls from oak trees, crushed them into a powder, and boiled them in rainwater. To this murky liquid, he added iron sulfate, which was called copperas, and watched as the mixture slowly darkened, turning a deep, satisfying black. For thickness, he added a little gum arabic, stirring the concoction with a wooden stick, the warm, earthy smell filling his small room. To give it the appearance of age, a faded, brownish tint, he would add a secret ingredient, a splash of porter or a bit of burnt sugar, a trick of his own devising. He would let the ink sit for days, allowing a fine layer of mold to form on its surface, which he would then carefully mix back in. He was not just making ink, he was brewing time itself in a little pot. Then came the most difficult part, the handwriting. Shakespeare's signature was known from a few surviving documents. It was a spidery, inconsistent thing, a gift to a forger. William spent countless hours, his brow furrowed in concentration, practicing the signature over and over again on scraps of paper. He would trace facsimiles, trying to capture the shaky rhythm, the unique flow of the quill. He studied other examples of Elizabethan script, the elaborate loops and flourishes, the peculiar spelling conventions. At first, his attempts were clumsy, a schoolboy's copy. But with a dreamer's persistence, he slowly, painstakingly, began to master it. His hand learned the ancient dance. Finally, he was ready. He chose for his first creation something simple, something believable. A mortgage deed between William Shakespeare and his fellow actor, John Hemmings. He took a piece of genuine 16th-century parchment he had carefully cut from the binding of an old book of sermons. He mixed his special ink, warming it slightly so it would flow more smoothly from the quill. In the dead of night, with only a single candle casting long, dancing shadows on the wall, he began to write. The scratch of the quill was the only sound. He formed each letter with intense concentration, imagining he was not forging, but transcribing, channeling the spirit of the past. For the signature, he held his breath. He wrote W. Shakespeare, making it look slightly cramped and uneven, as if dashed off in a hurry. To add a final touch of authenticity, he created a seal. He took a genuine Elizabethan seal he had found, pressed it into a piece of damp bread to create a mold, and then filled the impression with a mixture of melted wax and soot. He attached it to the document with a ribbon. When he was done, he held the small piece of parchment in his trembling hands. It looked perfect. It looked real. He held it over the candle flame, not close enough to burn, but just enough to age it further, to give it a smoky, time-worn patina. The moment of truth arrived on a cold December evening. The fire was crackling in the study, casting a warm, orange glow on Samuel Ireland's face as he pored over an old engraving. William entered the room, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He held the document in his hand. "Father," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Samuel looked up, slightly annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, William?" I have found something. Something remarkable." He held out the parchment. His father took it, his expression one of skepticism. He adjusted his spectacles, holding the deed closer to the candlelight. He read the archaic legal text. His eyes scanned the names, and then they fell upon the signature at the bottom. A profound silence descended upon the room, broken only by the snap and hiss of the fire. Samuel's hands, holding the document, began to shake. He looked up at his son, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning, incredible hope. "William, where did you get this?" he breathed. This was the part William had rehearsed. He had invented a story, a crucial piece of the puzzle. He spoke of a wealthy, reclusive gentleman, a Mr. H., who had a chest full of old family papers and, knowing of William's interest, had allowed him to look through them. This Mr. H., William explained, wished to remain anonymous. It was a simple yet brilliant invention. It provided a source for the documents while ensuring that source could never be questioned. Samuel Ireland was not a man to be easily fooled, but he was a man who desperately wanted to believe. He stared at the deed, then at his son, then back at the deed. He ran his fingers over the brittle parchment, squinted at the faded ink, examined the crumbly wax seal. Every detail seemed to confirm his most fervent wish. The desire to believe was so strong it overwhelmed any flicker of doubt. Tears welled in his eyes. He rose from his chair and embraced his son, a thing he had not done in years. "William, my boy, do you know what this is? Do you know what you have found?" And there it was, the look of pure, unadulterated pride and adoration. It was more potent, more wonderful than William had ever imagined. In that moment, bathed in the warm firelight and his father's ecstatic praise, William Henry Ireland was not a forger. He was a hero. He was the son his father had always wanted. The lie had taken root, and it was beautiful. This first success was like a potent drug. The approval was addictive. Soon, one document was not enough. Samuel and the small circle of antiquarians he immediately invited to view the treasure wanted more. And so William, fueled by his father's joy, returned to his secret workshop. The mysterious Mr. H proved to be a miraculously bountiful source. Out of the candlelit secrecy of William's room came a stream of wonders. There was a tender letter from Shakespeare to his wife, Anne Hathaway, written in a charmingly romantic, if slightly clumsy, hand. He called her Anna Hathaway, an archaic spelling William had invented. He enclosed a braided lock of his own hair, stained to look ancient, declaring it to be a lock of the bards. The antiquarians who saw it wept. Then came a profession of faith, a document in which Shakespeare declared himself a devout Protestant, a discovery that settled a long-standing debate among scholars and brought tears of pious joy to many. William crafted this document with particular care, filling it with beautiful, flowing prose that sounded, to the untrained ear, vaguely Shakespearean. He wrote of the unspotted boke of the holy God, and the sweet and charitable family of all mankind. It was a masterpiece of sentimental forgery. With each new discovery, the legend grew. The Ireland House on Norfolk Street became a site of pilgrimage. Learned men, famous authors, and wealthy patrons would arrive, hats in hand, begging for a glimpse of the Ireland papers. James Boswell, the famous biographer of Dr. Johnson, was one of them. An old, frail man by this point, he was brought to see the documents. Upon being shown the profession of faith and the letter to Anne, he fell to his knees, kissed the papers, and declared, "I shall now die happy, since I have lived to see the present day." He died shortly thereafter, his final days blessed by William's gentle deception. William watched all this from the corner of the room, a quiet, unassuming young man, the conduit for these miracles. He felt a dizzying mix of emotions. There was the thrill of success, the deep satisfaction of seeing his father so happy, his chest puffed with pride. Samuel was no longer just a collector. He was the custodian of a national treasure, and his son was the discoverer. But beneath the triumph, a cold tendril of fear had begun to curl. The lie was no longer a small, private thing between him and his father. It was a public spectacle. It was growing, taking on a life of its own, and he was no longer sure if he was its master or its prisoner. He would retreat to his room at night, the source of his power and his prison. He would look at his pots of ink, his scraps of parchment, his well-worn quill. These were the tools of his triumph, but they were also the evidence of his crime. The deception had started as a simple, heartfelt wish to please his father, a cozy little conspiracy for two. But now, the whispers of the parchment had become a roar that echoed through the literary world of London, and he did not know how to make it stop. He could only do one thing: give them more. And so, under the soft, forgiving glow of his candle, he began to dream of his most audacious creation yet, a work that would move beyond signatures and letters and give the world what it truly wanted. A lost play, written by the hand of William Shakespeare himself. The thought was terrifying and utterly irresistible. The new year dawned, and with it, the fame of the Ireland papers reached its zenith. The modest house on Norfolk Street was now the epicenter of a literary earthquake. The trickle of curious visitors had become a steady stream, a procession of the great and the good of London society, all eager to witness the miracles that had sprung from the mythical chest of the anonymous Mr. H. William Henry Ireland, once an invisible boy in the shadow of his father, was now a figure of quiet renown. He played his part with a gentle, humble grace, deflecting praise and speaking in hushed tones of the great fortune that had befallen him. He was the discoverer, the humble vessel chosen by fate to restore these treasures to the world. Inside, however, a storm of creativity and anxiety was raging. The pressure to produce more wonders was immense, not only from his ecstatic father but from the expectant public. The little lies had built a grand cathedral of deceit, and it required a constant supply of new pillars to keep it from collapsing. It was in this feverish atmosphere that the ultimate idea was born. If he could forge letters, deeds, and a profession of faith, why not the Holy Grail itself? A complete, unknown play by the master. The very thought was an act of breathtaking hubris. This was not a matter of a few lines of prose or a signature. It was an entire world of poetry, character, and plot. It would require a sustained act of literary ventriloquism on a scale he had never attempted. But the dreamer in him, the boy who had lost himself in Gothic tales, was captivated by the challenge. And the forger in him knew it was the logical and perhaps only next step. He chose for his subject a story from early British history, a tale of Saxon invaders and noble Britons, a story of love, betrayal, and war. He would call it Vortigern and Rowena. The title itself had a satisfyingly archaic, epic ring to it. He set to work with a new level of obsessive dedication. His small bedroom became a veritable factory of Shakespearean fabrication. The process was a ritual, a soothing repetition that kept his rising panic at bay. He would begin each night by preparing his materials. He found a large quantity of blank parchment leaves bound into an old account book, their edges feathered with age. He carefully treated them with a weak acid and held them to the fire to give them the perfect, time-browned crispness. He mixed his special ink, a large batch this time, adjusting the recipe with a little more soot to give it a darker, more dramatic look he felt a play manuscript deserved. He chose a variety of quills, some sharp for fine lines, others slightly blunted to create a broader, more hurried stroke. Then he would begin to write. But he was not merely copying. He was composing. He filled his mind with the rhythms of the Shakespeare he had read. He borrowed phrases, lifted entire lines from lesser-known Elizabethan playwrights, and stitched them together with his own, often clumsy, verses. He tried to mimic the bard's grandiloquence, but the result was often a hollow echo, a collection of forsooths, wherefores, and perchance scattered through stilted, overwrought speeches. He wrote of leathern analysts, leather daggers, and limbs o'erstripped, limbs outstretched. Delighting in the arcane spellings he was inventing on the fly, he created a beautifully messy manuscript, full of what he imagined were authentic details. He left blots and smudges. He crossed out lines and wrote corrections in the margins, as if Shakespeare himself had been struggling with a difficult passage. He even added a crude drawing in the margin, a sketch of a soldier, a touch of personal flair he felt the bard might have included. He worked for weeks, page after painstaking page, the scratch of his quill a constant secret song in the sleeping house. The world believed he was simply transcribing a found manuscript, but in truth, he was pouring his entire being, his romantic soul and his forger's cunning, into creating Vortigern and Rowena. When the manuscript was complete, its presentation to his father was the stuff of legend. Samuel Ireland beheld the thick sheaf of aged papers, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold them. A lost play, a full, 5-act tragedy by Shakespeare. It was a discovery that would dwarf all the others, a treasure beyond price. He wept openly, unabashedly, clutching the manuscript to his chest as if it were a long-lost child. News of the play exploded across London. The only logical next step was a performance. Samuel Ireland, now fully inhabiting his role as the great man's impresario, entered into negotiations with Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the celebrated playwright and manager of the prestigious Drury Lane Theatre. Sheridan was a wit and a cynic, a man of the world. He was skeptical of the paper's authenticity, but he was also a shrewd businessman. A lost Shakespeare play, real or not, was a guaranteed spectacle. The controversy alone would sell tickets. After some haggling, a deal was struck. Vortigern and Rowena would be staged at Drury Lane. As the production began to ramp up, however, a new and far more dangerous sound began to cut through the chorus of adulation. The quiet, methodical voice of doubt. The whispers had been there all along, from scholars who found the spelling too inconsistent, the language too modern. But now they had a champion. His name was Edmund Malone. Malone was everything Samuel Ireland was not. Where Samuel was a passionate, credulous enthusiast, Malone was a rigorous, cold-eyed academic. He was the foremost Shakespearean scholar of his day, a man who had dedicated his life to establishing an accurate, authentic text of the plays. He viewed the Ireland papers not with wonder, but with deep suspicion. He did not need to see them to know they were fakes. The discoveries were simply too convenient, too perfectly tailored to answer the sentimental questions of the age. While William was busy in his bedroom creating a play, Malone was busy in his own study, deconstructing the forgeries with surgical precision. He worked not from passion, but from evidence. He compiled a list of anachronisms, words and phrases used in the papers that did not exist in Shakespeare's time. He analyzed the handwriting, noting that it was not the fluid script of a man writing his own thoughts, but the careful, drawn hand of someone copying a model. He pointed out that the parchment, while old, showed no sign of the kind of wear and tear a genuine collection of documents would have accumulated. He noted the strange, almost comically overdone, archaic spelling. Malone was compiling his findings into a book, a comprehensive, irrefutable exposé of the entire affair. He worked quietly, methodically, his own quill scratching away, not to create a fiction, but to dismantle one. The stage was being set for two climaxes, one under the bright gaslights of Drury Lane, and another in the quiet, merciless pages of a scholarly treatise. The night of the premiere, April 2nd, 1796, was thick with anticipation. A nervous energy crackled through London. All of society was there, packed into the opulent theatre. Believers and skeptics sat side by side, eager for the verdict. William and his father and sisters had a box near the stage. From his vantage point, William could see the sea of faces, a blur of powdered wigs and silk gowns. The theatre smelled of perfume, damp wool, and the faint, sweet scent of the orange peels that were sold as refreshments. His heart was a trapped bird, fluttering wildly in his chest. This was the culmination of his dream, and he had a sickening premonition that it was about to become his nightmare. The play began. The actors, including the famous John Philip Kemble in the lead role of Vortigern, were uneasy. They disliked the play, finding the language clumsy and the plot preposterous. Kemble, in particular, was a known skeptic and seemed determined to let the audience know it. The first few acts passed in a tense quiet. There was some polite applause, but also scattered titters of derision from the back of the theatre where a group of Malone's supporters had gathered. William sat frozen, a cold sweat on his brow. Every stilted line of dialogue, which had sounded so grand and Shakespearean in the quiet of his room, now sounded hollow and ridiculous in the vast theater. He could feel the mood of the audience shifting, the initial curiosity curdling into amusement, and then into open mockery. The breaking point came in the fifth act. Vortigern, facing his doom, had a line that William had penned with what he thought was tragic grandeur. The line was, "And when this solemn mockery is o'er." John Philip Kemble strode to the front of the stage. He paused, looked directly at the audience, and delivered the line with such profound, exaggerated, and booming irony that its meaning was unmistakable. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, and then a single loud laugh erupted from the pit. It was a spark in a powder keg. Another laugh joined it, then another, and then the entire theater exploded in a tidal wave of derision. Howls, catcalls, and peals of unrestrained laughter washed over the actors, drowning out the rest of the play. The solemn mockery was indeed o'er. The play had not just failed. It had been laughed off the stage, becoming an instant and eternal punchline. For William, sitting in the box, the sound was not just laughter. It was the sound of his entire world shattering. He did not feel anger or even terror, but a strange, hollow numbness. It was the feeling of waking from an intense and vivid dream. He looked at his father. Samuel Ireland sat bolt upright, his face ashen, his expression one of utter, uncomprehending shock. He truly could not understand what was happening. He still believed. They fled the theater, a retreat through a gauntlet of smirking faces and knowing whispers. The journey home in the carriage was silent, the only sound the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves on the now empty streets. The cozy dream had evaporated, leaving behind only the cold, hard reality. A few days later, Malone's book was published. Its title was an indictment in itself, an inquiry into the authenticity of certain miscellaneous papers and legal instruments. It was a meticulous, devastating, and unanswerable demolition of every single document William had ever created. It left no room for doubt, no shadow for belief to hide in. The public humiliation was complete. The great con was over. The only thing left was the private reckoning. It happened as it had all begun in the study. The fire was low, casting weak, trembling shadows. Samuel Ireland sat in his chair, not with the triumphant posture of the bard's champion, but slumped like a man crushed by an immense weight. He held Malone's book in his hand. He had read it. He still desperately wanted to believe it was a lie, a jealous slander. He turned to his son, his last hope. "William," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Tell them they are wrong. Tell them of Mr. H. We will fight this." William looked at his father's face, a mask of desperate hope, and the lie finally died on his lips. He could not do it anymore. The weight was too much to bear. In a low, halting voice, he began to confess. He told his father everything. About the bookbinder's shop, about the old parchment, about the ink boiled over a candle in his room, about the long nights spent practicing the signature. He explained that there was no Mr. H, that there was no ancient chest of papers. There was only him. Samuel listened in absolute silence, his face slowly losing all expression, becoming a blank canvas of grief. The pride, the joy, the adoration that William had worked so hard to win, all drained away, replaced by something far worse than disappointment. A vast, empty chasm of betrayal. He did not yell. He did not rage. He simply looked at his son as if he were a stranger. The shared dream that had been their bond was now the very thing that had irrevocably broken them. Soon after, William Henry Ireland published his own confession, an authentic account of the Shakespearean manuscripts, hoping to exonerate his father by taking the full blame. It did little good. Samuel Ireland's reputation was ruined. He died a few years later, a broken man, still half convinced or perhaps half wishing that some of the papers might have been real after all. William left his father's house and lived a long, strange, and difficult life. He moved to France for a time, wrote Gothic novels and poetry, and was forever known as Shakespeare Ireland. The great forgery was an inescapable shadow that followed him to his grave. And yet, sometimes on quiet nights when the rain fell softly on the rooftops, perhaps the old man would sit by his own fire and remember. He would not remember the public shame or the laughter in the theater. He would remember the quiet, magical feeling of creation in his candlelit room. He would remember the earthy smell of his special ink, the satisfying scratch of the quill on ancient parchment, and the pure, intoxicating joy on his father's face. He had set out to forge Shakespeare, but in the end, the only thing he had truly created was a beautiful, fleeting, and heartbreaking dream. A cozy deception, born of a desperate love, that for a brief, shining moment, had managed to convince the world, and most importantly, his father, that magic was real. And in the telling, the story of the great Khan becomes not a tale of crime, but a soft, melancholic lullaby about a boy who simply wanted his father to look at him with wonder.